Hello, my name is Jay Rosenbeck. I'm chair of the Natural Resources Committee of the League of Women Voters of Alachua County. I want to welcome you to this first in a series of forums devoted to the topic of climate change, sponsored by the League. This one is entitled Climate Change and Health. The forum comprises 6 parts: brief introductory comments, 3 substantial presentations about the issue, a brief description of the next forum to pique your interest, and brief concluding remarks. Questions can be posed by completing the Google form posted on the League Facebook page. The appropriate speaker will answer your questions in writing and send them to you. They will also be posted on the League's Facebook page. And in addition, a recording of this event will be available on both Facebook and YouTube. For 100 years, the League has been dedicated to nonpartisan, data-based education and advocacy in support of our democracy. Issues, not political candidates, are its focus. The League began in support of the women's suffrage movement. 100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment was certified in an unwitnessed early morning signing at the home of Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby. Unfortunately, as you all know, that amendment secured voting rights for white women, but not for non-white, and thus the battle continued and continues in some form even today. So you might ask, why a forum on climate change on this historic date? Because we believe that Rebecca Solnit got it just right in her book, Call Them by Their Names, when she said, climate change is here and it is changing everything. It is bigger than anything else because it is everything for the imaginable future. The full title of this forum is Climate Change and Health, Understanding and Action. Why did we prioritize health? We got contributions from our speakers, of course, from others in the League, and from Ellen Moyer, who says in her book, human and environmental health are one. And we agree. And so let's begin the discussion of the topic. Our first speaker is Dr. Glenn Morris, Director of the Emerging Pathogens Institute at the University of Florida. On the Institute's website, we learn a great many things about Dr. Morris. I have just selected one. He has helped shape the creative vision behind a web of campus-wide projects to anticipate, understand, and control the emergence of new disease-causing microorganisms. Dr. Morris, please, your presentation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to this group, and indeed an extremely auspicious day. I'm Dr. Glenn Morris. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Florida School of Medicine, specializing in infectious diseases. I also direct the Emerging Pathogens Institute, which is an institute focused on understanding new and emerging pathogens. Most recently, I've spent most of my time giving talks about COVID, and it will actually be nice, probably not really to mention COVID that much this evening, but instead I'd like to talk about another area in which I've been involved and which has been of a great deal of concern to me. And again, in part, I was led into this area of climate and health because of my interest in understanding how climate changes may influence microorganisms that can cause human disease. So tonight, I'd like to talk about climate and health. Let me see if I can get this to work. Whoops. Okay. Hopefully, actually, if somebody can give me a nod saying that indeed the pictures are up there. Okay. So, when we talk about climate and health, the polar bears frequently are the ones we start talking about because that's where, everybody's worried about the polar bears. The polar bears have some real problems. But what I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit more about some of the problems that we are encountering as humans as we move beyond the polar bears. Let's see. So just to review some key facts, this comes from a summary done by the World Health Organization in 2018. Climate change affects the social and environmental determinants of health, clean air, safe drinking water, sufficient food, and secure shelter. Between the years 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from a variety of causes, including malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. The direct damage cost to health, excluding costs in health determining sectors such as agriculture and water and sanitation, is estimated to be between $2 and $4 billion per year by 2030. And of particular concern, and as I think will be mentioned in other parts of the discussion tonight, areas with weak health infrastructures in developing countries, but also in parts of this country, will be the least able to cope without assistance to prepare and respond. Again, I'm not going to go through this particular diagram in that much detail, but essentially what this does is emphasize the fact that the impact on health and health outcomes is driven by a variety of different factors. There are climate drivers, again, clearly the increased temperatures, sea level rise. There's the environmental and institutional context, social and behavioral context. Those come together into exposure pathways and finally lead into health outcomes. So again, there's not necessarily a direct cause and effect, single pathway type thing. What we're talking about is a variety of pathways that come together to create some of the health issues that we're discussing. So when we talk about temperature-related illness, first of all, are the effects simply of temperature itself. And these are generally categorized into three categories. There is heat exhaustion. This generally is exertional. That means you've been out jogging or doing a lot of exercise, your core temperature increases into the range of 101 to 104 degrees, and you can get weak, hypotensive, some evidence of dehydration. You can then move from there into heat injury, which is a multi-system illness characterized by organ and tissue damage, usually with a core temperature over 104 degrees. And then finally, if you start getting central nervous system dysfunction, you get into what's called heat stroke. And again, obviously, you don't want to go down any of these pathways, but clearly there are concerns about the factors that you can get in, the concerns, the health problems that can arise in these different categories. And what I would note is that one begins to get into potential problems as you get into times when there are elevated temperatures. And in particular, one of the areas that is of most concern is the projected number of days with temperatures over 95 degrees. And this is actually a model that was created looking just at Alachua County. And as you can see, as we move forward into the next few decades, by the time you hit 2050 here, you're going to be getting into the range of 40 to 50 to 60, perhaps 80 to 90 days here in Alachua County, where we're going to be having temperatures over 95 degrees. And so what creates the risk? I think, as was highlighted in Hurricane Irma, the simple increase in heat combined with, the body's response can cause problems and can cause deaths. And again, as this was picked up from the newspaper, 13th and 14th residents died from Florida nursing home that lost air conditioning after Hurricane Irma. The risk factors for heat stress and heat injury, again, that's sort of the first stages here. First of all are the ambient temperature and humidity. You need to keep in mind that evaporation really is ineffective for cooling when the humidity is over 75 degrees, and you get into these types of tables that talk about heat index. This is what the weatherman tells you each morning, or at least on some channels, what the temperature is going to be the equivalent of. And what it is a combination of relative humidity and temperature. And what you see is that particularly as your relative humidity increases, that the actual temperature may have a much greater effect and may be felt by the body as a much higher temperature. One thing I would mention that is actually useful in trying to understand this and the potential impact of heat stress is a really nice app. It's called the Heat Safety Tool that's put out by NIOSH, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And if you load it onto your cell phone, this is what it looks like. And actually, if you press the button, it will automatically calculate the heat index for where you are. I will say I just did the heat index calculation, and even at this time of the evening in Alachua County, the heat index was 103 degrees, which clearly begins to get into the area where one starts to worry about heat stress conditions. Now, when we talk about heat stress, again, we talk about exertional heat stress, which is really caused by exercise and this type of thing. And again, you're at risk for exertional heat stress if there is a lack of acclimatization, poor physical fitness, dehydration, obesity, equipment preventing heat loss, wearing long sleeves and heavy clothing when you're out jogging or out exercising, or just simply outside on a day like today, where, as I said, the heat index is 103 outside right at the moment. There's also non-exertional heat stress. And here, the key factors are age, underlying chronic medical conditions that impair thermal regulation, medications. And again, these are the factors that play into the types of deaths that we're seeing in the nursing homes that lost air conditioning after Hurricane Irma. I think the main thing to emphasize is that heat stress and even mortality effects are observed even for small differences from seasonal average temperatures. So this is real. One doesn't fortunately see it that often, but clearly when you get into heat indexes of the type we're seeing, particularly this summer, one runs into these problems. And again, what one sees in terms of projections is that with the increases in heat and associated increases in heat index, heat injury, one begins to see changes in deaths over the next period of years. These are two separate models. You can see the models differ, but nonetheless, it is clear that one sees increases. And again, this shows projected deaths due to extreme temperatures this is the 2000 baseline and for 2100. And needless to say, Florida is seeing a lot of projected increases in the mortality rate that are impacted by heat. Okay, so heat just by itself can cause problems. As I've indicated, you see heat stress, heat injury can progress to all the way up to heat stroke. Um, However, the heat also impacts air quality, and changing climate has modified weather patterns, which in turn have influenced patterns of outdoor air pollutants, ground level ozone, fine particulate matter, increased allergens, all of which can have negative impacts on the respiratory and cardiovascular system. What about pathogens? Again, this is what I do for a living. And what we find is that with ecosystem changes, what we see is changes and opportunities for growth and spread of existing pathogens. And we see several microorganisms that are of particular concern. The Vibrio species, these are bacteria that live out in the water, that include the etiologic agents for cholera, for diarrheal disease such as Vibrio perihemolyticus, and severe sepsis and severe wound infections caused by a Vibrio called Vibrio vulnificus. Like I say, these organisms live in the water, but they are very temperature sensitive, and rates of growth increase rapidly with increases in water temperature. So what we are seeing in multiple parts of the United States is a clear association between increasing human cases due to Vibrios and increasing water and sea surface temperature. The chart here shows the fact, points out that cases of Vibrios increase during the warmer summer months. And what we have seen over the last decade or so is a clear increase in the number of Vibrio species, and also in some of the harmful algal bloom species, such as parasite species such as Cryptosporidium. So with the increase in temperatures, increase in sea surface temperatures, one begins to see increases in heat-sensitive pathogens such as Vibrios. But it's not just Vibrios. What we find is that there are a number of infections that show a clear seasonality. During the summer, during warmer time periods, we see more cases of gram-negative bacteremia among hospitalized patients. We see more cases of salmonella and other bacterial foodborne infections. And again, this looks at a variety of different pathogens, and you see for most of them, you do see this summer increase. Again, bacteria like warmer weather. Many are not as sensitive to temperature changes as Vibrios are, but clearly one sees an increase in bacterial levels during summer. Vector-borne diseases. These are diseases that are spread by insects. And what one sees is that warming temperatures can permit seasonal expansion of vector species. Elevated temperatures can expand the seasonal range of specific vectors, and even increase things like the biting range. The mosquitoes go farther on a nice warm day. These graphs show some estimates that were made by some of our faculty here at University of Florida. And this is for the mosquito Aedes aegypti, which was is of particular concern with regard to things like dengue fever. Some of you may be aware right at the moment, and this warmer summer, we're seeing major problems with vector-borne diseases, dengue, West Nile, particularly down in South Florida. And again, what we see that as global temperatures increase, we can expect to see increasing numbers of mosquitoes, and we may well see increasing levels of some of these vector-borne diseases. Now, it's interesting that malaria, you sort of have an envelope of optimal temperatures. If you get too hot, then diseases like malaria may actually decrease in frequency. But at least for right now, these rising temperatures clearly are raising concerns about vector-borne diseases. And finally, they're harmful algal blooms. These are, blooms of algae where, in terms of human health impacts, with Ciguatera fish poisoning, there's increasing spread northward in the Gulf, and we have seen potential increases in cases in the Florida area. We're seeing increases in amnesic shellfish poisoning, where we find that low-level effects are associated with cognitive deficits, and we're seeing increasing recognition of the toxin in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. Cases reported in Maine this year. And finally, in animal and environmental health are the cyanobacter. These are this really yucky stuff that, you know, we've started to see in terms of some of the algal blooms here in Florida. And again, what we find is that, and this is a picture that's out of studies done here at UF, that as your nutrient loading, that actually as the temperature increases, it takes fewer nutrients to drive production of these huge masses of algae. So putting it all together, the ecosystem in which we live is complex. Even subtle changes in climate have the potential for impacting health. Areas of concern: extreme heat, high heat indexes, increases the likelihood of exertional heat stress, but also the non-exertional heat stress that's associated with age and chronic disease. Poor air quality, reduced food and water quality, changes in growth and transmission of infectious agents, and ultimately population displacements, which again can have profound impacts on health. For microorganisms, climate change can open or expand ecologic niches for pathogenic microorganisms. Increasing temperature, changes in rainfall or rainfall patterns, extreme climatic effects, rising carbon dioxide. And again, as you get at a less stable global environment, you're seeing increasing opportunities for emergence and reemergence of pathogens. So again, what I wanted to do in this brief presentation was sort of run through some of the key areas. We are still learning a lot about the relationship between climate change and health. It's an area of ongoing study, but I think the data are there to say that as we see ongoing increases in climate, and in particular for Florida, increases in heat indices and in overall temperatures, days above 95 degrees, we are going to see an increasing impact on human health. So I'm going to stop at that point and turn to the next person who is speaking today.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. That was concept and data rich and provides a firm foundation for our next two presenters. First of the two is Professor Joan Phlox. Professor Phlox is Director, Social Policy Division, Center for Governmental Responsibility, Levin College of Law. Professor Phlox has led several environmental justice and community-based participatory research projects, focusing on a variety of issues, including farm worker occupational and environmental health and community resilience. Professor Phlox, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Jay. And I want to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this panel on this important topic. I'm going to speak today about how climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable communities. And I want to do this from a perspective of environmental justice. I hope my screen is up. If I could get a thumbs up. Okay, great. Okay. So I'm going to present this through the lens of environmental justice, and I'm sure many of you likely know about environmental justice, but I still want to begin with a definition and some basic concepts just so I can develop a framework to discuss this. So first, here's a part of the EPA's most recent definition of environmental justice. Now, the EPA first defined environmental justice in about 1998. And this definition has evolved a little, but it's still a very broad and mainly aspirational view. It shifts away from the original concept of environmental justice, which was more about environmental racism. So you can see in this definition, it refers to the involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, et cetera. I think more valuable when we talk about environmental justice is to talk about some other characterizations of environmental justice, such as this deconstruction of what we talk about when we talk about justice. And this comes from some environmental justice scholars who break the concept of justice down into 4 elements: distributive, procedural, corrective, and social justice. Now, really briefly, I'll talk about each of these. So distributed justice is really what people traditionally think of when they think about environmental justice, right? That certain environmental hazards and burdens are disproportionately located or disproportionately affect certain populations. It also refers to the equal distribution of benefits, like parks and beaches and transportation and drinking water. And distributive justice for environmental justice advocates does not mean that distributing hazards in someone else's backyard is better. It means that there should be equal protection for all people and an attempt to eliminate hazards in all communities. Procedural justice is fairly straightforward. It's the equal concern and respect in the decision-making process about how things are distributed. And process can include things like access to information, public meetings, data collection, policy making, and a lot of these processes we know can be fairly political. Corrective justice is fairness in the way that punishments for law breaking are assigned and that damages inflicted on individuals and communities are addressed. In the environmental justice field, corrective justice really refers to the sense that violators should be caught and punished and not be able to reap the benefits from their wrongdoing. But it also refers to the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all way to punish environmental justice wrongdoers. It's not always beneficial to an affected community to win a court case. Monetary damages aren't always the solution to everything. Sometimes something needs to be fixed. Sometimes a community needs to be relocated. Sometimes people need equal access to health care. So the punishment really needs to fit the wrongdoing. And then finally, social justice is really where environmental justice integrates social, racial, and economic justice into environmentalism to make sure that members of every social group have enough resources and power to live decently. And this is really, for policymakers, the most intimidating component of environmental justice, because this is where it becomes less about or more than just about the environment. And this is where we recognize that environmental issues, including climate change, are also caused by and result in economic issues, race issues, political issues, and that environmental issues cannot be separated from these other structural issues. So what is really important about these 4 components of justice and environmental justice is that you really need to consider all 4 components in addressing an environmental injustice for there to be a sustainable resolution. And finally, one more piece of our framework is quickly, back in 1991, there was a summit called the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit And at this meeting, environmental justice activists and advocates came together and talked about environmental justice holistically, and expanded the framework to include issues of public health, worker safety, land use, transportation, housing, resource allocation, and most importantly, community empowerment. And at this meeting, they came up with these 17 principles of environmental justice. And they were developed as a guide for organizing and networking and relating to government and non-governmental organizations. The environmental justice scholar Robert Bullard condensed these into 5 characteristics, which I've reprinted here on the PowerPoint. I won't read them to you. You can see basically how they were condensed. I'll give you a minute to look at it. Okay, so moving forward, now that we have some definitions and components of environmental justice, because this is actually a presentation on climate justice, but first I do want to give you some examples of what environmental justice looks like in both a national and international perspective. So domestically, here are some examples of environmental injustice. There's many more examples. Kind of the traditional ideal about environmental justice, it has to do with the fact that communities of color are disproportionately located near undesirable land uses, such as industry or landfills. And communities that are located next to industry are often referred to as fence-line communities, and you can see why in this picture here of a playground right next to a factory or some sort of industry. Here's another example of a national environmental injustice, and that is that certain populations rely more on fish as a source of nutrition. Yet fish advisories traditionally did not consider that certain populations or practices, such as subsistence fishermen or Native American fish eaters, have different consumption patterns of fish. They may consume more of a fish, for example, or they may consume more fish. And the standards for fish advisories never took these special populations into account. The standards were set on a very different populations. Farm worker pesticide exposures. So the environmental justice movement, when it kind of broadened, it started taking into account occupational communities. And farm workers are one occupational community that's disproportionately affected by toxic substances like pesticides. And the regulation of pesticides doesn't necessarily consider the burdens of pesticides that farm workers are exposed to. It doesn't consider cumulative risks of pesticide exposure. The fact that farm workers are exposed to pesticides year after year for a lifetime of working. It doesn't also consider synergistic risks, like what happens when pesticides are combined. That's another example. And then finally, another example nationally are disparities in environmental benefits. One thing the environmental justice movement did is expand the concept of what we consider environment to include things like where we live, public places, neighborhoods, and buildings, what we now call or consider the built environment. And it's always been noted that certain communities have less access to environmental amenities, such as parks and green spaces and waterfront, that there's disparities in transportation. And more recent attention has been focused on the fact that we have what's been called food deserts in a lot of urban areas where people don't have access to places to buy nutritional food. Okay, examples of national environmental injustice. Here's some international environmental injustices. A lot of them that have to do with the extraction and exploitation of natural resources through mining or logging, oil extraction, The exploitation of local knowledge when it comes to, for example, botanical resources, another form of environmental injustice. Some other international examples, the exportation of hazardous waste to countries where these wastes are either recycled or sometimes dumped. One example that's gotten a lot of attention recently is the exportation of what's called e-waste. And e-waste is your computers and your cell phones. What happens when you recycle those? Sometimes they're shipped to countries in Africa or Asia where local people mine them basically for certain components. And it can be very hazardous to those populations. Some other international examples include the environmental degradation in border areas, like the US-Mexico border, which experience high levels of contamination. And then finally, true global issues like climate change, which are kind of happening all over the place, contributed to by everyone, and also the result of environmental refugees. Okay, so we have some definitions, we have some components of environmental justice, and we have some examples of environmental justice. The next question really is, what is the relationship between climate change and environmental justice? And I think a place to start is by remembering that environmental justice is a form of social justice. And social justice involves examining and addressing underlying structural inequities. And as it turns out, some of the underlying structural inequities result in some populations being disproportionately exposed to the ill effects of climate change. For example, a piece of history that has recently been getting a lot of media attention are policies and practices that have resulted in this legacy of residential segregation and marginalized low-income communities and communities of colors in locations that expose residents to more environmental burdens. So these include practices, historical practices, some of which used to be legal, of restrictive covenants and redlining. There's been a lot of talk about redlining lately. A lot of you know what redlining is, but I will define it. Redlining is the practice of when either government or private lenders would systematically deny loans to people who live in certain neighborhoods because they had determined those neighborhoods to be high risk. But that also were often communities of color. So just keep the term redlining in mind because we're going to come back to that in about 2 slides. First, though, let's look at what might be the most obvious example of the intersection between climate change and environmental justice. Now, if you assume that the increase in adverse weather conditions is a consequence of climate change, then you will see that Hurricane Katrina, a lot of people consider that a result of climate change. So I think the most obvious intersection is this of disaster vulnerability. And nothing really, again, illustrates disaster vulnerability in this connection better than Hurricane Katrina. So in Hurricane Katrina, we know that neighborhoods most affected were low-lying neighborhoods near the side of the levee that was breached. And they were locations that were historically less desirable. The houses in these areas themselves might have been less able to withstand the disaster, although Katrina was of such a magnitude that that took out all kinds of housing. But then there was other post-hurricane factors that also revealed how Katrina became a classic environmental justice story. The people that were most likely left behind were poor and African American. They had no transportation. The city emergency plan was inadequate to deal with the needs of the people left behind. The residents were forced to stay because they lacked the purchasing power to secure private alternatives in order to evacuate. And in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, these were the same people that were less able to withstand the shocks, like the health bills or rebuilding their property. And then more recently, there's been some discussion about the link between low-income urban neighborhoods and greater impacts from heat. Why is this important? Well, as Dr. Morris mentioned, extreme heat is very dangerous. In fact, it kills more Americans every year than any other weather-related disaster. And the populations most adversely impacted by heat-related illness include the elderly, children, low income, and outdoor workers, including farm workers. And heat waves are growing in intensity and frequency. So there's a very recent study that found that in 108 urban areas nationwide, formerly red-lined neighborhoods in nearly every area were hotter than the non-red-lined neighborhoods, including some by as much as 13 degrees. And the reason for this is through what is known as the urban heat island effect. And that is that in formerly red-lined neighborhoods, which were less desirable neighborhoods, we have this lack of environmental amenities. There's a lack of green spaces. There's more pavement and concrete. They may be closer to interstates. And all of those surfaces absorb heat and release it more slowly than green areas. So this map here is an example of what a redline neighbor map looked like back when it was drawn. Redlining, of course, now is illegal, but this was a former redline map of Tampa. Okay, so environmental justice also, like I said, considers occupational communities. And in terms of climate change, farm workers as outdoor workers are 20 times more likely at risk for heat-related death than other outdoor workers. And so here's some articles that are reports of farm worker deaths from California, Florida, and most recently, Georgia. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration has issued general recommendations for the protection of workers in all hot work environments. They primarily consist of providing water, rest, and shade, and using aids like the one picture here. Oh, sorry, using ads. I don't have that ad up. I'm sorry. But these are recommendations. There are no federal policies that exist for protecting workers from heat. There are only recommendations. There are a few states that do have regulations, California being one, not Florida. Several years ago, we did a study, or Emory University did a study, which I was a consultant for, with the Farm Worker Association of Florida in 5 different locations in Florida, where we extensively monitored the conditions that exposed farm workers to heat stress. And these are some of the tools that we use, and they're described over here. Probably the most innovative tool at the time was this core temp monitor, which the participants in the research study would swallow. It was an actual heat monitor. And then they wore this data recorder on their waist on a belt. And it took an active reading of what their internal core temperature was throughout the workday. And they wore it for 3 days. And we had 248 workers. You can imagine the massive amount of data that we accumulated from this. They also wore an actigraph that measured their activity rates so that we could get a reading or an understanding of what Dr. Morris described as the exertional heat, and then had monitors that monitored the ambient air temperature and also their home temperature, because there was previous study that found that that also had an effect on their internal temperature. So here's some of the results real quickly that we found, that from the 248 workers in this study. 90% of the participants exceeded the heat stress limit of 100. This is the national heat stress limit of 104 degree Fahrenheit on at least one day. 42% of the participants developed 3 or more symptoms of heat-related illness, including nausea, dizziness, excessive sweating, headaches, and 36% of the participants developed acute kidney injury on at least one day. That is just one of the possible effects of extreme heat-related illness, is that it can lead to acute kidney injury. Okay, so we've looked at environmental justice and examples of environmental justice, including how climate change has environmental justice implications. And so I'm wondering, I'm sure many people are wondering how we can address these issues. It's complicated. But I think the benefit of using an environmental justice framework to look at climate change impact is that you can see that addressing the underlying structural factors that create an environmental injustice will also help alleviate the impact of climate change. So currently, many climate change policies do not consider the needs of the communities that are most adversely affected by it. And in order for communities to be more resilient in the face of climate change, they have to be able to prepare for changes. They have to be able to withstand the impact, and they have to be able to recover. And those things are grounded and must take into account resolving social inequities, such as addressing spatial inequities, ensuring that people have safe neighborhoods and solid housing, addressing economic inequities, making sure that people have safe workplaces and the means to evacuate during a disaster, addressing procedural inequities, ensuring that people have a role in the decision-making process about climate change policy, especially when they're the ones that are the most adversely affected. And I think that only in that way can we achieve, this is the second part of the definition of the EPA's definition of environmental justice. Only in addressing those structural inequities can we achieve this second part of the EPA's definition, which is to ensure everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental hazards and has equal access to a process guaranteeing a healthy environment. Thank you.
You, Professor Phlox, your emphasis on environmental justice, your examples, and the background of care that you exhibit is much appreciated, are much appreciated by all of us. Our third speaker is Dr. Lisa Chaco. Dr. Chaco is a community physician and supervising physician to the City of Gainesville Employee Health Services. In addition to providing primary care as a family physician, Dr. Chaco is interested in disparities in health care, including access to and quality of care, especially for disadvantaged populations. She's also interested in addressing the emotional and physical toll of these disparities and the emotional toll that all of us suffer as we try to come to grips with the challenges of climate change and its threats to our health. Dr. Chaco, please.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the first two speakers. I learned a lot, and I'm sure you all did too. I am not here to speak about healthcare per se. Of course, we're talking broadly about climate change and its effect on our health, and I'm going to use my small window of time to strike a more personal tone about how climate change affects our mental health and affects our ability to be well, really. So as you listened to those two talks, I'm sure some of you felt overwhelmed. It is overwhelming to think about increasing rates of heat-related death, and it is overwhelming to think of the incredible inequity around environmental justice, as was just described. And climate change is overwhelming. It's a lot of information to integrate, and it is that sense of overwhelm that I actually want to speak about, with the basic premise being that until we can sort of move through that and past that, we may not actually engage this issue. Before I strike that more personal note, I just want to make a couple comments about climate change very, very broadly to make sure that we really are all on the same page about the facts. I'll draw from an interview with the author Davis Wallace Wells, who recently published a book called The Uninhabitable Earth, and just pull a couple salient facts from his comments that I think sort of lay the framework. Simply put, we have too much carbon in the atmosphere. We've been actively taking it out of the earth and putting it into the atmosphere. And one key fact to know is that that is accelerating. Half of all the carbon in our atmosphere arrived there within the past 30 years. And so it is stressful to recognize that the time window for real action is not only narrow, but it's narrowing, and it's narrowing quickly. Also, the fact is that only really broad collective collaborative action will quantitatively move the needle on climate change. We are essentially in the process of exiting the fossil fuel era. It's not a question of if we will do that. It's a question of how and how quickly and how well, or how painfully. And so again, that is all very overwhelming. We haven't really spoken about COVID today. And I just want to say that I think we've all learned a lot about ourselves, about our families, our communities, and about the world this year through COVID. A couple of things that I think are interesting that we have learned from ourselves, some of which actually may be reassuring. We learned that actually, to some degree, really broad global collective action is possible. Early in 2020, billions of people on this planet pivoted their behavior quickly and with very little notice. It wasn't universal cooperation, but billions of people stayed home from work and school, and that is fantastic. But we also learned that we collectively lack endurance and seem to lack stamina, and there's a lot of really real reasons why it is hard to endure that level of change. And finally, I would say that we learned that how we communicate science really matters, and that individuals' minds can be our primary obstacle to implementing what may seem like very common sense solutions. Certainly universal masking should be a lot easier than fixing climate change. And we see what sort of happened around that and the politicization of that. So again, a few facts on climate change, a little bit about us, what we've learned this year as a species, as a people. And now I just want to turn really to our individual mind. I am not using slides, so rest your eyes, rest your neck. You could consider this an audio if you want. It'll just be me here. So again, we were posed the question, how is climate change affecting our health? And like I already said, many of us feel overwhelmed. And I want to say that that is to be expected. Psychology, the basic psychological theory would say that, yes, it is normal to feel very overwhelmed by these realities and by these facts. As we speak right now, there is a Category 4 hurricane in the Gulf, and it went from Category 1 to 4 overnight. We have wildfires in California. Yes, this is very overwhelming, and there's tons of information. And so it's worth just giving ourselves some credit that it's okay to feel overwhelmed. But I want to talk a little bit about that because at some point we got to move past it, right? So there is a theory that some of you may be familiar with called cognitive dissonance. And it was first described in 1957 by a social psychologist. And what he said is that when we are forced to cope with contradictory ideas, this creates stress in our minds. And this requires energy and it requires effort and it leads to fatigue in the mind. Bear with me here for a second. When we have facts that maybe seem opposite or opposed, this leads to sort of internal inconsistencies. And we start to notice when maybe something that we know doesn't match our behavior. And this all sort of adds to our psychological discomfort. With this state in our minds, then our emotions become affected. And some of you may have had feelings of guilt or shame or just fatigue or just denial, anxiety, fear, all of these sort of emotions in response to the information that just doesn't quite fit in our current framework. And, you know, in line with the talks that we heard just now, as North Americans, we carry additional sense of guilt because we know that our country emits the vast majority of the carbon and that we are somewhat complicit. We are in fact the cause of this major global problem. You know, we'd like to believe that we're good actors in a fair world. And so this discomfort grows. And so the theory predicts that our mind has a natural impulse, which will be to resolve or reduce that discomfort. And the way that we do that is by pushing away facts, by choosing what to believe, by justifying some behaviors, and sometimes by avoiding circumstances or information that would increase our distress. And this can manifest in really innocent ways, like, I just can't read another article about climate change, it's too much, I just can't think about it, I get so worked up. And again, this is all normal and this is all actually predicted, but we're left with the question, is there a healthier or more productive way to resolve this mental emotional state? In his book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, George Marshall makes what I think is a very powerful comparison. And he compares climate science communication to a really bad religion that offers guilt and blame and fear, but no recourse to salvation or forgiveness. And if we pause, you know, we can see what he means, because there is this sense that it's all fire and brimstone and there's this language of apocalypse, and it's natural for our chests to get tight and to think, oh my gosh, I can't handle this. And so what George Marshall proposes, and I agree with, and it's one of the points I want to just put before you today, is that we really need a language of hope and shared values and forgiveness if we are going to transform our guilt and anxiety into something more productive. So where does this leave the individual? Many of us want to be good people. We want to have integrity. And sometimes we just don't know what our behavior should be in the face of this huge body of knowledge around climate change. And the question often arises, does it really matter what I do? If I ride my bike to work and nobody else is riding their bike to work, does that really make a difference? And quantitatively, probably it does not. But I would like to propose that qualitatively, our individual behaviors matter quite a lot. And I want to give you two simple reasons why I think that they matter. The first speaks directly to what I was just describing, which is that emotional milieu that many of us move in and out of that is very uncomfortable. Actually, the psychological theory would predict that if we engage in small incremental behavioral changes, that would be a healthy way to reduce the dissonance in our minds. And again, we're not doing these because we think we're going to save the world, but because we're sort of incrementally changing who we are, and we're changing our identity, increasing our awareness, increasing our mindfulness, and thus becoming more able emotionally to engage what is a very complicated issue. And I would just propose as sort of a common sense advice to anybody listening who's wondering, well, what behavior should I change? Start with the win-win behaviors, right? Because it's really sort of a beautiful non-coincidence that the behaviors that will reduce your carbon footprint just so happen to be the behaviors that directly benefit the health of your body and mind, and oftentimes of your bank account. And so think about diet, think about travel, think about spending and consumption. attention and look for ways to invite simplicity, frugality into those spaces, and you will already be making behavior changes that honor the facts of climate change and can also benefit directly your mental health, as I described. There's another reason why individual behavior matters. Again, less quantitative, more qualitative, but extremely important. And I want to use the example of Greta Thunberg to describe why. So I'm assuming everybody's heard of Greta, and certainly we cannot all be Greta presenting to the United Nations at the age of 15 and being nominated for Nobel Prizes twice before she's 20. But the story of Greta that is actually worth noting is that she went from severe clinical depression to world leadership. And I think it's worth noting how that happened. So when Greta was a child, she learned the facts of climate change. She felt overwhelmed. She became incredibly depressed, truly clinically depressed, didn't eat, lost weight. But she was depressed not because the problem was so big. She was depressed because as a child, she looked around and none of the adults in the room, nobody that she knew, and she couldn't find any examples, no one was doing anything about this. And that is what depressed Greta. Now, it wasn't until her parents started making small concessions to reduce their own carbon footprint that Greta began to have hope again. And then from there, we know the rest of the story. She made the sign, she sat in front of the building, and all of the rest. And so what this describes is the idea of behavioral contagion. This idea that even within our families and in our homes, we need leadership and we need examples and we need inspiration. And there's a beautiful quote by an author, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, that says, "Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching to mend what is within our reach. And it is never for us to know which acts or by whom will cause the critical mass to tip toward an enduring good." And so, yes, your individual behavior matters to the children around you, to the people around you, and probably more importantly to yourself, to your own sense of sort of inner correctness and integrity. I would like to make another comment about children because I talked about Greta. Children have an incredibly important role to play in all of this. You know, Greta essentially was that child in the story that said, "The emperor is naked." And just about any child out there is capable of saying the emperor is naked because they are so honest. Children have hope, they have resiliency, they have creativity, they have much of the energy that we need to face this issue. And I think we should not shy away from sharing the facts with them. Another incredible story about a child is Jane Goodall. So Jane Goodall today is 86 years old. She is a fierce climate activist. And to this day, she cites her mother as being the reason she became who she was. It was because her mother took her ideas seriously. Her mother let her explore. And today, Jane Goodall calls on us all to instill awe in our children as sort of the beginning of mending what she sees as the fundamental problem of our species, which is the disconnect between our minds and our hearts. And so children really can offer us that language of hope, and they can come up with beautiful and creative ideas. I encourage you to take that challenge and speak to whatever children you know and see what solutions they shout out. I know my kids had some really, really creative ones that gave me hope. And on the topic of hope, you know, I think that there is something sort of nostalgically and quintessentially American about hope and optimism, that certainly this obsession with potential and promise as progress has led us down the wrong road many, many times. And yet we have in the threads of our thinkers and our writers, many of the ingredients that we need to deal with this. If you think of writers like Emerson and Thoreau, who brought together nature and nation and imagination, you know, this is an ethos that could help us move towards a really healthy and vibrant future. You know, I mentioned earlier this idea of climate science communication as a very bad religion. And, you know, even in the 70s, René Dubos said, "Our salvation depends on our ability to create a religion of nature suited to the needs and the knowledge of modern men and women." And he spoke about a theology of the earth. You know, maybe these words don't resonate for you, but certainly we need a new language that can pull more people into this movement from a space of inspiration. I just have a couple of concluding thoughts. The first is, one question that's been raised for me as I thought about this is, are we able to think like a species? You know, I was actually advised not to use that word species in this talk. I was told that people wouldn't understand it, that they would relate more to the idea of belonging to a civilization or a society or a culture, but not to a species. And yet that is what we are essentially talking about, because the Save the Planet movement in a way was misbranded. In reality, as we see what Dr. Morris described with the destabilization of our habitats, increasing temperatures, algae blooms, we are essentially going to create habitats that we can no longer live in. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, what we're talking about is the extinction of our species, right? So it's not so much about saving the planet, it's about saving our species. The wildfires in California, the first reports coming out right now are that the 2,000-year-old redwood trees are still standing. And so that is evidence that some of these habitats will survive and we will not. Jane Goodall says, it is bizarre to me that the most intellectual animal is destroying its habitat. So again, this line of thought may feel a little bit scary, but I would just leave you with the question that I'm left with still and don't have an answer to, which is, what does it mean for us to think like a species? So in conclusion, I would just say your overwhelm is normal, but we do need to move past it. And there are ways to do that. I believe that individual behavior is one of them. So begin with the win-win behaviors. Begin with trying to shape your language, even with how you speak with yourself and how you think about this issue. Again, we need hope. We need shared values. We need forgiveness. We need to allow people in who maybe have not been in on this movement, because we may be surprised who comes to the table with some really important solutions here. The goal must be dialogue, and for dialogue, we need a language. Ultimately, your sense of overwhelm will either defeat you and you will stay quasi or unengaged, or it will transform you and we may be part of the most incredible human experiment of all time. And you will definitely have moments of feeling discouraged. To quote the same author that I quoted earlier, she talks about despair and she says, I do not keep a chair for despair at my table. I will not entertain it, and it is not allowed to eat from my plate. So at some point, we need to fend off this despair, and we need to sort of work on this internal journey, because the basic premise here is that until we work on our inner transformation, we will never be able to even imagine the degree of outer transformation that is needed here. There's a lot of work to be done. Thank you so much for including me.
Thank you, Dr. Chaco. I appreciate it, and I suspect others did too, being reminded that negative emotions are, if not normal, at least common, that there are solutions. And I especially appreciated your emphasis on language, because at some point that's all we have, and the language that we use has profound influence on how we feel and how we act. That was excellent. Before saying a few final words about climate change and health, I want to introduce my co-chair and good friend, Dr. Jeffrey Shapiro, to say a few words about the next in this series of climate change forums.
Thank you, Jay. You've seen in this set of talks how interrelated everything is. And especially when we look at the aspects of health versus, say, economics, we have a lot of argument about, should we pay more attention to the economics or to the health? It's all interrelated. And our next forum in this series will try to address climate change and economics. We will incorporate, of course, some of the ideas that you've heard tonight, and the pandemic that we now suffer, which is leading to both economic weaknesses and opportunities for change, it cannot be ignored. Inequalities already plague our neighborhoods. We see that here in Gainesville. Environmentally unsustainable homes, rising property costs and values, and changing impacts of weather on our landscapes are examples that we can see here. These impacts have to be met eventually, and preferably sooner than that. affordable home renovations can lead to sustainable weatherization, for example. Influx of climate refugees into our area from South Florida can be met with new, more economical means of building new neighborhoods and preserving the old. Floods and wind damage can be avoided by rewarding safe locations and building practices while penalizing poor choices. So there's a lot that we can do. And I hope that our talk on economics can bring the macro into the microeconomics, and we can begin to see how, as you've just heard, we as individuals can begin to affect climate change and its effects on our populations. So stay tuned for the next in this series, Slowing the Economic Steamroller of Climate Change. I expect that we shall be able to provide this forum sometime in late October, early November. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Before the thank yous, I want to leave us with a few lines from Bill McKibben, longtime activist, good person, good writer. In his book, Falter, McKibben says, "When I think about the world in its present form, what overwhelms me is the human love that works to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. The love that comes together in defense of sea turtles and sea ice and all around us that is good." Finally, I want to acknowledge the conceptual and procedural contributions of the League of Women Voters intern, Erin Wright. I want especially to thank our speakers and those of you in the audience who took time today to listen to the material that was presented. And finally, I would ask that we all remember Bill's words, that we stay well and help others and the earth do the same. Thank you. Good night.